Maria wiped down the last table at Danny's diner as the clock struck midnight. Her feet ached from standing for 12 hours straight, but she couldn't complain. This job was all that stood between her family and complete disaster. The tips weren't much, but combined with her minimum wage salary, it was just enough to keep food on the table and pay rent on their tiny apartment. She walked to the back office where Danny was counting the day's earnings. His face looked grim, and Maria felt her stomach drop even before he spoke. "I'm sorry, Maria, I have to let you go," Danny said without looking up from the cash register. "Business has been slow for months. I can't afford to keep everyone on." The words hit her like a physical blow. "But Danny, you know I have 2 kids. I've worked here for 3 years without missing a single shift. I know, and you're a good worker. But I'm barely keeping this place open as it is. I'm really sorry." Maria stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. In less than 30 seconds, her entire world had crumbled. She gathered her things and walked out into the cold night air, wondering how she would explain this to her children. At home, 8-year-old Carlos was sleeping peacefully in the small bedroom he shared with his 6-year-old sister Isabella. They had no idea that their mother's worst nightmare had just become reality. Maria sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills, and tried to figure out what to do next. The rent was due in 5 days. She had exactly $47 in her checking account, and maybe $20 in loose change scattered around the apartment. Even if she found another job immediately, she wouldn't get paid in time to make rent. And finding a job immediately seemed impossible in their small town where opportunities were scarce. Over the next few days, Maria applied everywhere she could think of. The grocery store, the gas station, even the fast food place that had just opened near the highway. But everyone wanted experience she didn't have or couldn't offer the hours she needed. Some places weren't hiring at all. As the days passed, desperation crept in. Maria started selling anything of value she owned. Her grandmother's jewelry went first, then the small television, then Carlos's bike that he had gotten for his birthday. It wasn't enough. Not even close. That's when she remembered the storage unit full of items her neighbor had asked her to sell. Mrs. Chun had moved to a nursing home and couldn't take most of her belongings. She had given Maria permission to sell whatever she could and keep half the money for her trouble. Maria had been putting it off, but now it seemed like her only option. She set up a small table outside the apartment complex and started selling Mrs. Chun's items: books, kitchen gadgets, old picture frames, and clothes. It wasn't much, but every dollar helped. For a few days, it seemed like maybe she could make this work. She was bringing in $30 or $40 a day, which wasn't enough to pay all the bills, but it was something. Then Mr. Rodriguez, her landlord, showed up. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the table full of items. "Just selling some things to help with rent," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't run a business on my property without permission, and I don't think you have the proper licenses for this kind of thing." Maria felt panic rising in her chest. "It's not really a business. I'm just trying to sell a few things to help pay you the rent I owe." "How much do you owe me?" he asked. "I can get you the money," Maria said quickly. "I just need a little more time." Mr. Rodriguez looked at the table, then at Maria. "You're 3 days late on rent. You're running an illegal business on my property. And now you're telling me you don't have my money? Please, Mr. Rodriguez, I have 2 children. "I just lost my job. I'm doing everything I can." But his expression had already hardened. "I can't have tenants who don't pay their bills and break the rules. I'm calling the police." "The police? For what? You're operating a business without a license." "That's illegal. And I suspect some of these items might be stolen. How do I know you didn't take these things from other apartments?" Maria's blood ran cold. "These aren't stolen. Mrs. Chun gave them to me to sell. I can prove it." "Well, let the police figure that out." Within an hour, 2 police officers arrived. Maria tried to explain the situation, but Mr. Rodriguez had already painted her as a problem tenant who was running an illegal business and possibly selling stolen goods. The officers seemed more interested in resolving the complaint quickly than understanding the full situation. Do you have a business license? One of the officers asked. No, but I wasn't really running a business. I was just... Do you have documentation proving you own these items? Maria's heart sank. Mrs. Chun had moved out months ago, and they had handled everything with a handshake and verbal agreement. There was no paperwork. I can call Mrs. Chun. She's at Sunset Manor Nursing Home. She tell you, ma'am, we need to see documentation. Without that, we have to treat this as a possible theft situation. The next few hours passed like a nightmare. Maria was arrested and charged with operating a business without a license and theft by deception. Because it was late on a Friday afternoon, she wouldn't see a judge until Monday. The bail was set at $500, which might as well have been $5,000 for all the good it did her. Worse than her own situation was what happened to Carlos and Isabella. With no family nearby and no one else to call, the children were placed in emergency foster care. Maria watched helplessly as a social worker explained to her confused and frightened children that they would be staying with strangers for a while. When is Mama coming home? Isabella asked, tears streaming down her face. The social worker gave a gentle but non-committal answer about how they were working to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. But Maria could see in the woman's eyes that this might take much longer than anyone wanted to admit. In the county jail, Maria found herself in a cell with 3 other women who were there for similar reasons. One couldn't pay traffic fines that had accumulated over months. Another was behind bars because she couldn't afford court costs from a minor shoplifting charge. The third woman had been there for 6 weeks because she owed money for her daughter's truancy fines. How long do people usually stay here? Maria asked. Depends on how much you owe and how much you can pay, said the woman who had been there. Longest. Every day you're here they add more fees. Housing costs, meal costs, processing fees. The debt just keeps growing. Maria felt sick. She had come in owing $500 for bail, but now there would be daily fees on top of that. The longer she stayed, the more impossible it would become to get out. And while she was trapped here, her children were living with strangers, probably wondering why their mother had abandoned them. The system seemed designed to keep people like her locked up. Too poor to pay the fine, too poor to hire a real lawyer, too poor to post bail. Every day that passed made her situation worse, not better. And somewhere across town, Carlos and Isabella were learning to live without the only parent they had ever known, all because their mother had tried to sell a few items to keep them from becoming homeless. The concrete walls of Cell Block D felt like they were closing in on Maria with each passing day. This wasn't like the jails she had seen in movies. There were no hardened criminals here, no violent offenders. Just ordinary people whose only crime was being too poor to pay their debts. Her cellmate, Linda, had been there for 2 months. She was a grandmother in her 60s who couldn't afford to pay parking tickets that had piled up while she was caring for her sick husband. The fine started at $200, but with late fees, court costs, and daily jail expenses, her debt had grown to over $3,000. How is this even legal? Maria asked during their second night together. Linda laughed bitterly. Legal? Honey, they don't call it a debtor's prison. They call it an alternative sentencing program. Makes it sound like they're doing us a favor. In the bed across from them was Rita, a young woman who worked at a flower shop until she was arrested for not paying child support. The twist was that Rita was a single mother herself, and the child support she owed was from a clerical error in the court system. But proving that required a lawyer she couldn't afford. The fourth woman in their cell was Dolores, who spoke very little English. She had been picked up for selling food from a cart without a permit. Her husband worked construction, but his wages weren't enough to cover both their basic living expenses and the $1,500 needed to get her out. Every morning at 6, a guard would wake them for what the jail called economic counseling. This was supposed to help them find ways to pay their debts and secure their release. In reality, it was just a lecture about personal responsibility delivered by someone who had never missed a meal or worried about keeping the lights on. If you really wanted to pay your debts, you'd find a way, the counselor would say. There are always options if you're willing to work hard enough. Maria wanted to scream. She had worked hard her entire life. She had never asked for handouts or made excuses. But working hard didn't matter when there weren't enough jobs that paid living wages. The daily fees were crushing. $50 a day for housing, $15 for each meal, $10 for medical care even if you didn't need it, $5 for laundry service whether your clothes got washed or not. Maria's original $500 bail had already grown to over $800 and she'd only been there a week. The food was barely edible. Breakfast was usually a piece of stale bread with watery oatmeal. Lunch might be a sandwich made with processed meat that looked and tasted like cardboard. Dinner was often just beans and rice, with maybe a piece of fruit that was either completely unripe or rotting, but the worst part wasn't the conditions or the fees. It was the phone calls. Every other day, Maria was allowed to make a 10-minute phone call to check on Carlos and Isabella. The calls cost $5 each, money she couldn't afford but couldn't bear not to spend. Her children were staying with the Patterson family, who seemed kind enough, but they were strangers. Are you coming home, Mama? Isabella would ask every time, her voice small and confused. Soon, baby? Mama is working on it, Maria would lie, her heart breaking a little more with each conversation. Carlos, being older, asked harder questions. Did you really steal things, Mama? Mrs. Patterson says you might have to stay there for a long time. Maria tried to explain that she hadn't stolen anything, that there had been a misunderstanding, but how do you explain a broken system to an 8-year-old? How do you tell your child that their mother is trapped because she's poor? The other women in the cell had similar stories. Linda hadn't spoken to her grandchildren in weeks because she couldn't afford the phone calls. Rita's own children thought she had abandoned them. Dolores cried herself to sleep every night, worried about her husband trying to manage their 3 young children alone. One day, a new woman was brought in. Angela was a teacher who had been arrested for not paying medical bills from when her daughter had cancer. Even with insurance, the costs had been overwhelming. She had been making small payments when she could, but apparently not fast enough for the hospital's liking. I've been teaching for 15 years, Angela told them that first night. I have a master's degree. I've never even gotten a speeding ticket before this. And now I'm in jail because my child got sick. Her story was different from the others, but the end result was the same. She couldn't afford to get out, and every day she stayed made it harder to ever leave. The guards treated them like they were dangerous criminals. During the 1 hour of recreation time they got each day, they were watched constantly and spoken to harshly. One guard, Officer Martinez, seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding them why they were there. You're not victims, he would say. You're here because you made bad choices. Rich people don't end up in jail for debt because they don't let their bills pile up. What Officer Martinez didn't understand was that none of these women had chosen to be poor. Linda had worked as a seamstress for 40 years before arthritis forced her to retire. Rita had been laid off when the factory where she worked moved operations overseas. Dolores had been supporting her family the only way she knew how. Angela had devoted her life to educating children and still couldn't afford her daughter's medical care. The mental toll was as bad as the physical conditions. Maria found herself losing hope with each passing day. She started having nightmares about her children forgetting her face or deciding they were better off without her. She imagined Carlos and Isabella growing up thinking their mother was a criminal who had abandoned them. Linda tried to keep everyone's spirits up by sharing stories about her grandchildren or talking about the garden she wanted to plant when she got out. But even Linda's optimism was wearing thin after 2 months of the same concrete walls and the same hopeless routine. The legal system seemed designed to keep them trapped. Maria had been assigned a public defender who had 15 minutes to review her case before her first court appearance. He advised her to plead guilty to reduce charges, which would mean a permanent criminal record but possibly shorter jail time. The alternative was to fight the charges and risk staying in jail even longer while awaiting trial. How is that a choice? Maria asked him. It's the choice you have, he replied with the tired voice of someone who had this conversation many times. Before Angela, with her teaching background, tried to help the other women understand their legal options. But even she was overwhelmed by the complexity of a system that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate people who couldn't afford proper representation. As Maria's second week in jail ended, she realized that her original plan to get out quickly and return to her children was just a fantasy. The system had them trapped in a cycle where the punishment created the very problems it claimed to solve. They were in jail because they couldn't pay their debts, but being in jail made it impossible to earn money to pay those debts, and somewhere across town, Carlos and Isabella were learning to live without their mother, probably wondering if she would ever come home again. Tom Wilson pulled his beat-up pickup truck into the parking space outside the courthouse, the back loaded with supplies for his cattle ranch. At 52, his weathered hands and sun-beaten face told the story of a man who had spent most of his life working under the Texas sky. Life hadn't been easy since his wife Rebecca died 3 years ago, leaving him to raise 5 children on his own. The youngest, Katie, was only 7 when her mother passed. The oldest, Michael, was 17 now and helped with the ranch work, but Tom still felt overwhelmed most days. Between managing 2,000 acres of grazing land, keeping up with cattle prices, and making sure his kids did their homework, he barely had time to breathe. He was here today to pick up feed permits, a routine task that usually took about 20 minutes. But as he walked through the courthouse lobby, he couldn't help but overhear a heated conversation between 2 men in expensive suits. "Judge Henderson is getting nervous about the whole program," one of them was saying. "The ACLU is starting to ask questions about why we have so many people locked up for unpaid fines." "It's perfectly legal," the other replied. "We're not imprisoning people for debt. We're holding them for failure to appear or contempt of court. The fact that they can't pay is irrelevant." Tom slowed his pace, pretending to read a bulletin board. While he listened, "Come on, David, you and I both know what this really is. We've got 63 people in that jail right now who are only there because they can't afford to pay fines. Most of them are women with children, and they should have thought about that before they broke the law." "Broke the law?" "Half of them are there for things like unpaid parking tickets or selling food without a permit. One woman has been locked up for 8 weeks because she owes $400 in traffic fines." Tom felt his stomach turn. He remembered his own struggles after Rebecca died, when medical bills and funeral costs had nearly bankrupted him. If not for his brother lending him money and the life insurance payout, he could have easily found himself in a similar situation. The conversation continued as the 2 men walked toward the elevator. "The worst part is the kids," the first man said. "We've got dozens of children in foster care because their parents are locked up for being poor. The state is paying more to house these kids than it would cost to just pay the parents' fines." After completing his business at the courthouse, Tom couldn't shake what he had heard. That evening, after helping his youngest daughter Emma with her math homework and making sure all 5 kids were fed and bathed, he sat down at his computer and started researching. What he found made him sick to his stomach. The county had what they called an alternative sentencing program that was supposed to help people work off their debts instead of going to jail. But in practice, it had become a way to lock up poor people indefinitely while charging them more money every day. Tom read case after case of people trapped in the system. A single mother named Maria, who had been locked up for 3 weeks because she tried to sell items to pay her rent. A grandmother imprisoned for 2 months over unpaid parking tickets. A teacher jailed because she couldn't afford her daughter's medical bills. The more he read, the angrier he became. These weren't criminals. These were people who reminded him of his own neighbors, his own friends, maybe even himself if circumstances had been different. He called his brother Jake, who lived in the next county over. "You ever heard of this debt prison thing they've got going here?" Tom asked. "Yeah, I've heard rumors. Pretty messed up if you ask me. Why?" Tom explained what he had learned. Jake listened quietly, then said, "So what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. What can I do?" "More than you think, probably. You remember when Rebecca was in the hospital and you were worried about losing the ranch? What did I tell you then?" Tom remembered. Jake had said that when you see someone drowning, you don't stand on the shore wondering if you're a good enough swimmer. You jump in and figure it out as you go. The next day, Tom drove to the legal aid office he had found online. It was in a strip mall between a pawn shop and a check cashing place, which seemed fitting given the clientele it served. The lawyer, Patricia Hernandez, looked exhausted. Her desk was covered with files, and she had the appearance of someone who was fighting a losing battle against an overwhelming system. "I'm here about the people locked up for unpaid fines," Tom said. Patricia looked up with weary eyes. "Are you a family member of someone who's detained?" "No, I'm just a citizen who thinks this whole thing is wrong." For the first time since Tom had walked in, Patricia's expression brightened slightly. "We don't get many people who aren't directly affected by this. What exactly do you want to know?" Patricia explained how the system worked. People would be arrested for minor infractions, unable to afford bail or fines. While in jail, they would accumulate daily fees that made their debt grow larger. Most were assigned public defenders who had hundreds of cases and could spend very little time on each one. "The saddest cases are the parents," Patricia said, pulling out a file. "We have children scattered across foster homes because their mothers or fathers are locked up for amounts that you or I might spend on a nice dinner out." She showed him Maria's case. A single mother arrested for trying to sell items to pay rent. Now locked up for almost a month with 2 children in foster care. "How much would it cost to get her out?" Tom asked. "Her bail is set at $500, but with the daily fees, she now owes about $1,200. Even if someone paid that? Today, she'd still have to deal with the criminal charges, which could put her right back in jail." Tom thought about his own children at home, safe and loved, never having to wonder if their father would come home that night. He imagined how terrified he would be if someone took them away because he couldn't afford to pay a fine. What if someone paid the bail for multiple people? Patricia stared at him. "Are you serious? How many people are we talking about, and how much money?" Patricia pulled out another file. "There are currently 18 people in the program who are there solely because they can't afford their fines. Total bail for all of them would be around $15,000. Tom's ranch had been doing well the past 2 years. Cattle prices were up, and he had been saving money for his kids' college funds. 15,000 was a lot, but it wasn't impossible. What happens after they get out? That's the bigger problem. Most of them will still face criminal charges. They'll need legal representation, and many will need jobs and housing. Bail is just the beginning." Tom drove home that night thinking about Rebecca. She had always said that having money was a responsibility, not just a privilege. "If you're blessed enough to help someone," she used to tell the kids, "then you're obligated to do it." He looked at his 5 children around the dinner table, laughing and arguing about their day at school. They had no idea how lucky they were to have stability, to have a parent who could protect them from the worst parts of the world. But across town, other children were lying in strange beds, wondering why their parents had disappeared, not understanding that the only crime their mothers and fathers had committed was being poor. Tom made his decision that night. Tomorrow, he would go back to Patricia's office with his checkbook. Tom Wilson walked into the legal aid office the next morning with his checkbook in hand and a determination that surprised even him. Patricia looked up from her desk, clearly not expecting to see him again so soon. "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday," Tom said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "About those 18 people locked up just because they can't pay their fines." Patricia put down her pen and gave him her full attention. "And I want to pay their bail, all of them." The lawyer stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Wilson, I appreciate the sentiment, but we're talking about a significant amount of money, and bail is just the beginning of their problems." "I understand that, but they can't solve any of their other problems while they're locked up, can they?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "No, they can't, but what you're proposing, it's not something I've ever seen before. Are you sure you've thought this through?" Tom had spent most of the night thinking about it. He'd walked through his house, looking at his children's rooms, their toys, their school pictures on the walls. He'd thought about Rebecca and what she would say if she were here. He'd thought about his own parents, who had taught him that helping Others wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do when you had the means. I've got the money, he said simply. My ranch is doing well and I've been saving for years. $15,000 won't break me, but it could change everything for those families. Patricia pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Okay. Let's say you're serious about this. We need to do it right. Just posting bail won't solve the underlying legal issues. These people will still need representation, and some of them will need jobs and housing. What if we handle it all at once? Tom asked. What if we not only get them out, but also challenge the whole system that put them there? That would require a much bigger legal effort. We'd need to file a class action lawsuit, argue that the entire program violates constitutional rights. It would take months, maybe years, and cost a lot more money. Tom thought about Maria, locked up for a month just for trying to feed her children. He thought about Linda, the grandmother who hadn't seen her family in 2 months over parking tickets. He thought about all the children sleeping in foster homes while their parents sat in jail for the crime of being poor. How much more money? Patricia did some quick calculations. For a proper legal challenge, we'd need expert witnesses, court filings, research. Probably another 30,000, maybe more. I'll do it. Mr. Wilson, that's nearly $50,000 total. Are you absolutely sure about this? Tom nodded. My wife always said that money sitting in the bank doesn't help anybody. She'd want me to use it for something that mattered. The process took 3 days to organize. Patricia had to coordinate with the court system, prepare legal documents, and notify all the families involved. Tom insisted on being present when each person was released. Maria was the first to walk out of the jail. She looked thinner than in her booking photo, her eyes hollow from weeks of worry and poor sleep. When Patricia explained that a stranger had paid her bail, Maria's first reaction was suspicion. Why would someone do that? What do they want from me? He doesn't want anything, Patricia said gently. He just thinks what happened to you was wrong. Tom stepped forward. Ma'am, my name is Tom Wilson. I heard about your situation and the others, and I wanted to help. Maria looked at him with confusion and wariness. I don't understand. You don't even know me. I know you're a mother who was trying to take care of her children. I know you've been separated from them for a month because you couldn't afford to pay a fine. That's all I need to know. Tears started flowing down Maria's face. My children, are they okay? Can I see them? Patricia had already been working on that. We've contacted child services. There will be some paperwork, but you should be able to see Carlos and Isabella today. One by one, the other 17 people were released throughout the day. Linda, the grandmother, broke down crying when she realized she could finally call her grandchildren. Rita hugged Tom so tightly he thought she might break his ribs. Angela, the teacher, kept asking if this was really happening or if she was dreaming, but Tom knew that getting them out was only half the battle. These people still faced criminal charges, still had damaged credit, still needed jobs and housing. Some, like Maria, had lost their apartments while in jail. Others had been fired from their jobs for not showing up. I've been thinking, Tom told Patricia as they watched the last person walk out of the jail. Just paying their bail isn't enough. They need a real chance to get back on their feet. What did you have in mind? My ranch is big and I've got more work than I can handle. Some of these folks could come work for me while they sort out their legal issues. At least then they'd have income and a place to stay. Patricia stared at him. You want to offer jobs to people you've never met? I want to give them the same chance I'd want someone to give my children if they were in trouble. Maria was the first to accept Tom's offer. She had nowhere else to go. Her apartment had been rented to someone else, and she had no family in the area. Tom had a small cottage on his property that hadn't been used since his father-in-law lived there years ago. It needed some work, but it was clean and had running water and electricity. I don't know anything about ranch work, Maria admitted as Tom showed her around the property. You'll learn. The important thing is that you're here with your children, and you're safe. When Carlos and Isabella were finally returned to their mother, the reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. The children clung to Maria as if they were afraid she might disappear again. Isabella, only 6 years old, kept asking if the bad people were going to take her mama away again. "No, baby," Maria whispered, holding her daughter tight. "Mama's not going anywhere." Tom's own children were initially skeptical about the new arrivals. His oldest son, Michael, worried that their father was being taken advantage of. His daughter Jessica wondered why they were helping strangers when they had their own problems to deal with. "Because," Tom explained to them over dinner, "when you have the power to help someone and you choose not to, you become part of the problem." "Your mother taught me that." The legal challenge that Patricia filed gained attention beyond their small county. News reporters started calling, wanting to know about the rancher who had single-handedly freed 18 people from what they were, calling a modern debtor's prison. Tom didn't like the attention, but he understood its value. If this story helps other people in other places, then it's worth it. He told Patricia the lawsuit argued that the county's debt collection program violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and the 8th Amendment's prohibition against excessive fines. It would take time to work through the courts, but Tom was patient. He had learned from ranching that the most important changes happen slowly. With steady pressure applied over time, Maria proved to be a quick learner and a dedicated worker. Within a month, she was managing the ranch's bookkeeping and helping coordinate the daily operations. Her children adapted to rural life, and for the first time in years, they felt secure. "I don't know how to thank you," Maria told Tom one evening as they watched the sunset from the ranch's front porch. "You don't need to thank me," Tom replied. "You just need to be here for your children. That's thanks enough." 2 years had passed since Tom Wilson first walked into that legal aid office with his checkbook. The lawsuit against the county had made national headlines, and the debt collection program had been shut down permanently. But for Tom, the real victory was much more personal. Maria stood in the kitchen of the main ranch house, preparing breakfast for what had become an unusual but loving family. Her children, Carlos and Isabella, were now 10 and 8, and they moved around the house with the confidence of kids who knew they belonged. Tom's 5 children had initially been suspicious of the newcomers, but time had a way of healing old wounds and building new bonds. "Dad, Maria made pancakes again," called out Katie, Tom's youngest, as she ran into the dining room. At 9 years old, she couldn't remember a time when Maria and her children weren't part of their daily life. Tom smiled as he watched his expanded family gather around the breakfast table. It hadn't been easy at first. His teenage son, Michael, had resented sharing his father's attention, and Jessica had worried that their financial security was being threatened by Tom's generosity. But slowly, they had all learned to see Maria not as a stranger their father had rescued, but as someone who had rescued them right back. Maria had proven herself invaluable to the ranch operation. Her attention to detail and natural organizational skills had helped Tom streamline everything from cattle breeding records to supply ordering. What started as a temporary job had evolved into a true partnership. She now managed most of the day-to-day operations while Tom focused on the bigger picture of expanding the ranch's sustainability programs. "The reporter from Dallas wants to do a follow-up story," Maria told Tom as she set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "She wants to know how we're doing 2 years later." Tom shook his head. "I still don't understand why people find this so interesting. We just did what needed to be done." "Because most people don't do what needs to be done," Maria replied. "They see problems and assume someone else will fix them." The legal victory had been sweeter than anyone expected. Not only had the court ruled that the county's debt collection program was unconstitutional, but the judge had also ordered the county to expunge the criminal records of everyone who had been imprisoned through the program the ruling had set, a precedent that other counties across the state were being forced to follow. Patricia, the legal aid lawyer, had used the publicity from the case to expand her practice. She now had 5 attorneys working with her, and they had successfully challenged similar programs in 7 other counties. The work was funded partly by Tom's continuing donations, but also by a network of supporters who had been inspired by the story. Linda A grandmother who had been imprisoned over parking tickets had become one of Patricia's most effective advocates. She traveled around the state telling her story at legal conferences and community meetings. Her presence at these events, a dignified grandmother in her 70s, made it impossible for people to dismiss the victims of debt collection programs as somehow deserving their fate. "When people see me," Linda often said, "they see their own grandmother. They understand that this could happen to anyone." The changes weren't just legal and political. They were deeply personal for everyone involved. Carlos had struggled with anger and trust issues after being separated from his mother, but life on the ranch had given him an outlet for his emotions. He spent hours working with the horses, and Tom had been teaching him about animal care and ranch management. "Carlos is a natural," Tom told Maria one evening as they watched the boy gentle a young colt. "He has that calm energy that animals respond to." Isabella had bloomed in the rural environment. The shy, traumatized 6-year-old had grown into a confident 8-year-old who climbed trees, collected eggs from the chickens, and charmed everyone she met. She and Katie had become inseparable, more like sisters than friends. The transformation? And Maria was perhaps the most remarkable. The desperate, broken woman who had walked out of jail 2 years ago had been replaced by someone confident and purposeful. She had enrolled in online business classes and was working toward a degree in agricultural management. But more importantly, she had found her voice as an advocate for others. Maria now spoke regularly at conferences and policy meetings, sharing her story with lawmakers and advocates. She had a way of making the abstract concept of debt imprisonment real and personal for audiences who might otherwise dismiss it as a problem affecting only other people. "I'd tell them about trying to sell items on the street to feed my children," she said after returning from a conference in Austin. "I tell them about the phone calls from jail, trying to explain to Carlos and Isabella why Mama couldn't come home. I make them understand that we're not statistics. We're families." The relationship between Tom and Maria had evolved slowly and naturally. What started as gratitude and practical partnership had deepened into genuine affection and then love. They were married in a simple ceremony on the ranch 18 months after her release, with all 7 children serving as the wedding party. Tom's children had initially been uncertain about their father remarrying, but Maria had never tried to replace their mother's memory. Instead, she honored Rebecca's legacy while building something new. She kept photos of Rebecca throughout the house and encouraged the children to share stories about their mother. "Your mom sounds like she was an amazing woman," Maria told Jessica one evening as they worked together in the garden. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Jessica replied, and Tom knew that his daughter truly meant it. The ranch itself had become a model for other operations in the area. Tom and Maria had implemented sustainable farming practices, expanded their cattle operation, and started an internship program for young people interested in agriculture. Some of the other people who had been released from the debt collection program had found permanent work on neighboring ranches, creating a network of support that extended beyond Tom's property. But perhaps the most important change was in the next generation. Tom's children and Maria's children had learned lessons about justice, compassion, and social responsibility that would stay with them for life. They had seen firsthand how individual action could create systemic change. Michael, now 19 and about to start college, planned to study law with the goal of working in criminal justice reform. "I want to make sure what happened to Maria never happens to anyone else," he told his father. The ripple effects continued to spread. The story had inspired similar acts of generosity in other communities. A business owner in Oklahoma had paid the bail for 12 people trapped in debt collection programs. A church in Louisiana had started a fund to help people pay fines before they could be imprisoned. A retired teacher in Arizona had successfully lobbied her state legislature to ban debt-based imprisonment entirely. Tom often thought about the conversation he had overheard in the courthouse that first day. One of those lawyers had said that the worst part was the children. All those kids separated from their parents because of poverty. Now, hundreds of children across multiple states were sleeping in their own beds instead of foster homes because people had decided to act. As Tom and Maria sat on the porch one evening, Watching their combined family play in the yard, he reflected on how much had changed since that day he had walked into Patricia's office with his checkbook. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria asked, as if reading his thoughts. Tom watched Carlos teaching Katie how to throw a rope while Isabella and Jessica chased fireflies in the growing dusk. "Regret helping you?" "Never. Not just helping me, all of it. The money, the lawsuit, the attention. Your life got a lot more complicated." Tom considered the question seriously. His life had indeed become more complicated, but it had also become richer, more meaningful, more connected to something larger than just his own family's welfare. "Rebecca used to say that money was like water," he said finally. "If you try to hold on to it too tightly, it slips through your fingers. But if you let it flow where it's needed, it nourishes everything it touches." The lawsuit had been won, the unjust system had been dismantled, and dozens of families had been reunited. But the real victory was happening right here in this yard, where 7 children from 2 families had learned that love could multiply rather than divide, and that doing the right thing usually led to more joy, not less. Tom Wilson had set out to free 18 people from jail. In the end, he had freed something much more important, the possibility that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose compassion over indifference.